This episode is brought to you by Netflix. Jay Kelly, the new film from Academy Award nominee Noah Baumbach. George Clooney stars as an actor confronting his past and present on a journey of self-discovery, alongside Adam Sandler as his devoted manager. Critics are calling it a declaration of love to the chaotic art of filmmaking, with the Wall Street Journal praising it as a transcendent comedy drama. Jay Kelly is now playing only on Netflix.
Introducing Meta Ray-Ban Display, the world's most advanced AI glasses. With a full color display built into the lens of the glasses, it's there when you need it and gone when you don't. Send and receive messages, translate or caption live conversations, collaborate with Meta AI, and more. Be one of the first to try Meta Ray-Ban Display. Visit meta.com/Meta Ray-Ban Display to book a demo and find your pair.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Today's episode is brought to you by Babbel, the #1 selling language learning app in the world. Now, as you know, Ben Franklin's World is a show for people who love history. Each week, we talk to historians about the people, places, and events that have shaped our present-day world. But how do these scholars actually know what they know? More often than not, they know what they know because they've spent dozens, if not hundreds of hours poring over manuscripts, letters, and ledger books, often in several different languages. See, the past didn't just happen in one language, so the study of it can't happen in just one language either. That's why I'm a huge fan of language learning. Learning and understanding a new language enriches not only your mind, but your knowledge of the size and scope of the world and its history. And with Babbel, you can learn just about any language you want to learn, like Spanish, French, Italian, German, Russian, or even one of my additional languages, Dutch or Nederlands. And you can learn these languages through fun lessons that take just 10 to 15 minutes. You can take these lessons through Babbel's handy smartphone or tablet app, or online with your computer. Now, what's great about Babbel's fun lessons are their practicality. Babbel's designed its lessons to take you through all sorts of practical situations, like chatting with new friends, ordering food, asking for directions, and more. The practicality and fun of language learning through Babbel is something that you can try for yourself. Babbel is offering you a special listener-only discount of 50% off your first 3 months. So go to Babbel.com and use offer code BFWorld to take advantage of this offer. That's Babbel, BABBEL.com, and use promo code BFWorld to get 50% off your first 3 months.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 201 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. After the American Revolution, Americans grappled with many questions about what it meant to be an American and a citizen of the new republic. And some of those questions took up the issue of character. What kind of character should Americans have? Was it possible to create a shared sense of national character and identity that all Americans could subscribe to? And if it was possible, how do you spread the elements and ideas of that national character far and wide? Just after the Revolution, Americans were really diverse groups of people who hailed from many different ethnic and cultural traditions. So the question of how you unite these disparate peoples into one national people was a critical one. Now, one of the answers early Americans came up with as to how they could unite Americans together as one people came in the form and tool of taste, that ability that everyone has to discern what is of good quality or high aesthetic standard. And early Americans believed that if you had a good sense of taste, then you had the virtue necessary to belong to the American people. So today, Catherine Kelly, the editor of books at the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture, joins us to explore the world of art, politics, and taste in the early American Republic, and how that world contributed to the formation of American character and virtue. Now, as we explore this world of early American taste, Kathy reveals early American ideas about taste and how it could be used to build and shape the new republic. the ways Americans hoped taste would unify them into one national people, and information about aesthetic entrepreneurs, those promoters and small business owners who attempted to capitalize on the early Republican need and desire for taste. But first, a quick note on our guest. Last summer, Kathy Kelly came up to the Massachusetts Historical Society to give a talk on her book, Republic of Taste. Now, I couldn't make her talk, and my friends at the MHS let me know that it was really my loss because Kathy was amazing. They also said that I should try and get Kathy on the show because she'd make a great guest. Now, this suggestion made a lot of sense to me because you've actually been asking me a lot of questions about material culture, or, the goods and objects that early Americans made, used, and incorporated into their daily lives. So all around, I knew Kathy would be a great fit for the show. But as these things go, I couldn't get her into the editorial calendar until the spring. And wouldn't you know, by that point, she'd become my colleague at the Omohundro Institute. So yes, our guest is one of my OI colleagues, and that's actually a great thing for all of us. It's great for me because she's a brilliant scholar and a lot of fun to work with. And it's great for you because not only do we get to hear about her fantastic scholarship, but having her on the show and letting her get behind the scenes of Ben Franklin's world may help us innovate and develop something new and fresh for the future. So I just wanted to disclose the story of how and why Kathy came to be one of our guest historians. I still have complete editorial control of the podcast, and the Omohundro Institute applies no pressure for me to feature my colleagues or its books on the show. But I do occasionally feature them because the Omohundro Institute has some of the best scholars working for it, and it publishes some of the best projects about early American history. So with that note, I hope you're ready for a fantastic and interesting conversation because we're in for a real treat. And with that, let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Joining us is the editor of books at the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture. She's the former editor of both the Journal of the Early Republic and the digital publication Commonplace. She's the author of numerous essays and of 2 books, including In the New England Fashion, Reshaping Women's Lives in the 19th Century, and, most recently, Republic of Taste, Art, Politics, and Everyday Life in Early America. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Catherine Kelly.
Thank you, Liz. I'm delighted to be here.
And we're happy to have you here, Kathy. Now, I know you're here to talk about taste and its role in shaping the early American Republic, but I wonder if before we dive into that conversation, if we could talk about your larger work for a moment. You're a historian and you're an editor. Would you tell us how you became an editor and about how you work?
I think that I had always been interested in editing. A million years ago, I had an ancient career in journalism before I went to graduate school and became a historian. And I enjoyed working on other people's texts. In that way, editing is not all that different from the kind of work that you do as a professor, where you're working with students to help them write the best and the clearest essays or dissertations that they can write. But more than that, when you're editing for a particular publication, or in the case of the Omohundro Institute, you're editing for a book series, what it allows you to do is to shape something more than an individual piece of work. It enables you to shape the whole journal, to build a book series, and to really shape the way that the field develops. And I find that to be really exciting and deeply satisfying. You're both helping individuals do the best work that they can do, but you're also making the field move a little bit further.
You mentioned that you're editing a series of books for the Omohundro Institute, and we know that they publish books, but what exactly is their book series?
The series is the collection of books taken together. So we would call our series, it's a series of books on vast early America, essentially. Everything that we publish is part of this series.
And how do you help put this series of books together? When we think of an editor, we probably think of somebody who's going through our papers or books line by line. But what is it that you do as the editor of books?
My job essentially works 2 ways. About a third to a quarter of what I do is what I would call Institute inward-facing work. And that's working with our professional copy editors, with the source checkers who work to make sure that all of the facts and the bibliographic details and the manuscripts are accurate and correct. Most publishers nowadays, especially academic, but also trade publishers, subcontract that work out. We do it all professionally. We do it all in-house. And so a certain amount of my work is engaged with those folks. And it's that kind of work that helps to make sure that our books maintain the standard of excellence that they maintain. The rest of my job, and I would say it's really the lion's share of my job, is what I would call outward facing. And that is working with scholars, historians, but also literary critics and literary historians, art historians, and so forth, helping to identify and solicit and to also to develop projects, to bring them into the Institute and to bring them into our book series in the best possible shape that they can be in, to help ensure that the quality of the books that the Institute publishes remains high. And that's enormously exciting. You get to see the best work as it's being developed. You get to see the best work as it's coming together. And it really does help you to see how the field is progressing.
Wow. You really have a front row seat to how our knowledge about early American history is always changing and expanding. And speaking of which, we should probably now turn to your expansion of our ideas about early American history by exploring the ways in which taste shaped the early republic. Now, the title of your book is Republic of Taste: Art, Politics, and Everyday Life in Early America. And I wonder if you would tell us what you mean by the Republic of Taste. Was the Republic of Taste an actual place, or is it just an idea to describe the concepts that you studied?
Yes, it's both, actually. From one perspective, the Republic of Taste is an abstract idea. It's a conception or a kind of an intellectual, cultural conceit. And what it refers to is the notion that a shared sense of taste can help bring people together, that it can help unify both individuals, but also that it can unify collectivities of people, including the citizens of an emerging nation. The Republic of Taste exists at that sort of rarefied, intellectual, abstract level. But in order to be realized in daily life, in order to take shape on the ground, it has to be made real, literally, in homes, in museums, in theaters, at parades, in real physical spaces that are filled up with real bodies of breathing, sentient human beings who are surrounded by magazines and books and poems and paintings and all kinds of things like that.
When we talk about taste today, we know that there are broader forces in society that help us define it. So when we talk about taste in the early republic, who or what defined the taste early Americans should have had?
I don't think there's any particular one person or group of people who are defining taste. One of the interesting things about the way that taste works in the early republic is that there's a tension that runs through it. On the one hand, no one that I found in that period in the United States is willing to say that there is an absolute standard of taste and that are a particular group of people or class of people who define taste and who decide what good taste really is. On the other hand, taste itself as a concept, but also as a practice, is exclusionary. It's designed to weed out things that aren't tasteful, things that are deemed as being in bad taste, or we would say now kind of tacky. And so it's an ongoing process of elevating certain kinds of behaviors or objects or images or practices and pushing others off into the background, into the recesses. It's an elastic concept, hard to pin down. And that was exactly, in some ways, the power of how taste worked. It was well suited to capture both the inclusive and the aspirational elements of living in the early republic, because it wasn't tied to a particular income level. It wasn't tied to living in a particular place. It wasn't tied to being a member of a particular gender. It wasn't tied to a specific class, at least in theory. Could invite everybody in. It's enormously aspirational. It speaks of opening opportunity. But on the other hand, taste is designed to be exclusionary, to weed out the people who have poor taste, the people who don't have the kind of discretion to determine good from bad, to make those sorts of distinctions. And while taste isn't tied exactly to money, to capital, to class, it's also true that it was a lot easier to exercise good taste and to be recognized as being a tasteful person if you were the daughter of a respectable family who had fallen on hard times than if you were, say, a laborer who was trying to improve his status in the world by crawling up the social ladder.
So people who had a good sense of taste might find the Republic of Taste to be a welcoming and inclusive place, whereas people who had a bad sense of taste might find themselves excluded from the Republic of Taste. That makes taste sound like it was really important to the early Republic and to one standing within that Republic. So, how did early Americans learn to develop an appropriate sense of taste?
There are all kinds of institutions in place in the early Republic that were aimed at cultivating taste. Any of the intellectuals that you would have read from that period who talk about taste would have shared the sense that every individual has an inherent capacity for taste, and it simply needs to be brought out and cultivated. And so academies and schools include a significant portion of the curriculum that's aimed at cultivating taste, and even things that we would think of as not being connected to taste, like the ability to read, the ability to write in longhand, to write cursive, the ability to speak, the ability to write rhetorically, to compose a letter, to compose a brief essay. These were not simply signals or badges of education. These were also badges of taste. So those kinds of institutions work to develop a sense of taste. The newspapers and magazines of the early Republic are full of tutorials, for want of a better word, on how to develop your sense of taste. So how that you, Liz Covart, can improve the sense of taste or the capacity of taste that you've been born with. In addition to those outright tutorials, the literary culture of the early Republic is filled with examples of tasteful writing, tasteful poetry, tasteful travel writing. And taken together, the literature, the academies, the museums where people go to look at exhibits, to look at paintings, to look at sculpture, to cultivate their taste. The traveling they do, where they observe the landscape and write down what they see in their travel diaries and in their letters in language that recapitulates the language of landscape aesthetic appreciation. All of these things work to help develop taste.
It almost sounds like these newspaper and magazine articles and even the literature you just mentioned was a form of early American self-help.
Absolutely. That's exactly what it is. There's a business then, as now, a relatively healthy business back then, I would say, in helping people to improve themselves by helping them to both improve their taste, but also to improve the mechanisms, the social mechanisms, the material mechanisms through which they can then demonstrate that taste to others. One of the things that's important to understand about taste, at least in the early Republic, is that although it's deeply internalized and it has moral connotations and a sort of an ethical weight and import then that I don't think that it has now, it can only be realized in society. You can have all of the taste in the world inside you, but it doesn't mean that much unless you register your taste by showing your appreciation, by showing your discernment, by showing your ability to truly appreciate a particular painting, a sculpture, a museum exhibit, a piece of music to other people. And also then through your appreciation of the tasteful individuals with whom you surround yourself, to recognize and reinforce the fact that they are also tasteful, just like you are.
Now, you note in the Republic of Taste that taste served as a forum for Americans to think through the issues that faced the new republic. Issues such as the limits and meaning of liberty, what structure their government should take and how they should be represented in that government, or who should and shouldn't be included in citizenship. So, would you tell us how Americans thought about and considered these important issues through different forms of taste? Art, literature, poetry, theater, and other such forms?
I think I would say a couple of things. And one is that it's less that I can point to particular paintings and say, this is a painting that exemplifies the application of taste to a political debate or a political project in the early Republic. It's far more pervasive than all of that. Because taste was seen as being a barometer of character, because taste was seen as being a barometer of an individual's virtue, it is pervasive to ideas about politics and public character and citizenship in the early Republic. It would have been inconceivable for George Washington or Thomas Jefferson to imagine a good citizen and not to think about that citizen as having taste. Washington, in fact, praises Julius Caesar at one point as being a highly cultivated man, partly for his understanding, but also for his taste. When we think about Julius Caesar today, regardless of how we're approaching him, taste is not one of the first things we're going to think about praising him for, but it was to Washington. The language of aesthetics, the transatlantic canon, lexicon, vocabulary of aesthetics shapes the ways in which Americans can talk about and imagine political structures, but also political participation. So, for example, John Adams refers famously to legislative bodies in the period leading up to the Revolution as representations of the people in miniature. And by that, he means he's likening legislatures quite literally to miniature portraits. The language of aesthetics pervades discussions of politics, even when you don't expect to see it. So take, for example, the word chaste, which in the 18th century means purity, but particularly stylistic purity, conforming to the norms of a particular style or genre. Thomas Jefferson uses that word all the time, and he uses it not only to think about things that we might associate with taste, things with aesthetic value like gardens or painting or music. He uses it to describe parliamentary procedure. He uses it to describe citizenship. He uses it to describe debates over military expenditures. So there's this enormous cross-pollination between the language of aesthetics, the language of taste, the language of politics. The same kinds of imaginative constructs that Americans used to think about aesthetics and beauty and taste and value and virtue, they used to think about political society and society more generally.
Do you think you could give us an example of a piece of artwork or literature or, I don't know, even a play that really stood in for a big political issue that early Americans were thinking about and trying to grapple with through ideas about taste?
Any portrait of George Washington would do, and that would range not only from the sort of canonical portraits, the ones that we associate now with Washington, like Gilbert Stuart's famous George Washington, which is the face of the Washington we all know, to Charles Wilson Peele's many portraits of George Washington, to Edward Savage's portraits of Washington. What those portraits did was to figure virtue and to do so in ways that were explicitly political. The point of all of these portraits of Washington, and no one particular one will do for this example, is to create images of virtue. And the hope was, the belief was, that citizens would look upon portraits of Washington, that they would see his virtue, and virtue and taste are closely aligned, that they would see his virtue in his face, depicted on the canvas, depicted in that portrait in front of him, and that they would then be able to internalize that, to understand it, to grasp it far more deeply than they could simply by reading about Washington. And that once those virtues and once that taste was internalized within them, they would be able to project that out into the world. They would be able to put that into practice in their everyday life.
Thomas Jefferson is someone who has come up a couple of times during our conversation. And in your book, Republic of Taste, you note that he had this really interesting notion that taste could be something that could facilitate and even spread the creation of an American identity among the American people. Why did Jefferson and others think this? Why did they believe that taste could unify and create a shared sense of national identity?
It's not just Jefferson, it's all of the founders that I've looked at. They share this widespread sense that taste enables, or at least that taste can enable Americans to join together. Part of this faith in the taste's ability to hold society together, to hold collectivities together, is part of a transatlantic Enlightenment 18th century conversation in which thinkers on both sides of the Atlantic are imagining taste as a kind of a glue that can hold society together, creating affinities between like-minded individuals. In the United States, that takes on a particular urgency in the years following the Revolution. The Republic is large. We talk now at the Institute about vast early America, but the early American Republic is vast for the people who were living there. What's going to join together individuals in states as different and far-flung as Maine, Vermont, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, down into the Carolinas, to Georgia? How are all of these diverse people going to join together? What is going to create unity among them? taste is a thing that can do that. You've got a shared sense of affinity, a shared sense of appreciation for art and music and culture. And again, understand that this shared appreciation for good painting, for fine sculpture, isn't taste in the narrow way I think that we think about it today. It's not simply for them a matter of preferring mid-century modern to Victorian. Taste is deeply personal. It comes from the innermost recesses of one's character. It speaks to one's moral quality. So when you talk about taste pulling people together, when Jefferson talked about taste providing a grounding for the nation, he wasn't just hoping that everybody would build houses in the same style, or that they would plant their gardens in the same way, or that they would dress in a particular way. He was really hoping to see a national character emerge.
So Americans had this sense of taste, which we know is deeply personal, but was also a tool that they could use to talk collectively about ideas about government and early republic society. Taste became something that linked Americans together. Now, Kathy, did taste perform the same function when they were colonists? Did taste unite British Americans together as Britons? And if it did, in what ways did their new sense of taste as American citizens differ from their old sense of taste as British subjects?
This is one of the best things, as far as I'm concerned, about studying taste in the early republic. But the short answer to that question is that there's almost no difference at all. The kinds of things that Americans were reading, the paintings that they were purchasing, that they were commissioning, that they were painting, the music, the museums, all of these things are almost identical to what they would have encountered in Britain had they been able to travel there. The notion that there is some sort of distinctly American portrait or American taste or an American style is a fallacy. I mean, it's a story that Americans told themselves in the years after the Revolution to make their incisively, insistently Anglo-American culture into something else. Essentially, they keep sitting on the same chairs. They eat off of the same plates. They read the same novels. They look at the same portraits. But now they're telling themselves that in this post-revolutionary context, these things are filled up with new kinds of meaning that make them somehow inherently, transcendently American and virtuous and tasteful in a distinctly Republican way.
Was this sense of taste, which basically stayed the same between the colonial and early republic periods, was this sense of taste something new in the sense that Americans actually relied on it more during the early republic period than they did as British subjects or members of the British Empire?
The sense of taste is as important after the revolution as it is before the revolution. And what makes it different is precisely the notion that in the post-revolutionary period, it's invested with explicitly political significance that isn't there before. It was possible for individuals, and indeed likely for individuals living in 1750, people who were congratulating themselves on their gentility, on their tasteful furnishings, their tasteful clothing, their tasteful attire, to see that taste as a badge of their belonging to British imperial, British metropolitan culture. So taste works to anglicize Americans in the period running up to the revolution. In the period following the revolution, taste becomes invested with new political meaning, and all of it's associated with the Republic. What does begin to change in the period following the revolution is that there's a real uptick in the number of Americans who are engaged with producing their own literary publications. They're making their own paintings. They're building their own landscape gardens. They're opening their own museums. They're creating their own traveling shows with single exhibit paintings, large-scale canvases that tour the country, or touring wax exhibits, things like that. So there's a way in which the production of taste, or the objects and the images that spell taste, that signify taste, that accelerates after the revolution. And that's got everything to do with the expansion of the market. What's different about these kinds of things pre-revolution, post-revolution, is the meanings that people apply to them, the meanings that people ascribe to them. And then those meanings, if we're thinking about art or painting, portraiture, we're thinking about a particular museum, or the fact that there are museums in the early republic as a badge of taste that signifies Republican virtue, as these things begin to mushroom and multiply through the 1790s, the 1800s, and the 18-teens, they in turn provide evidence that the Republic is succeeding because you're seeing this sort of proliferation of virtuous symbols across a Republican landscape.
You mentioned the expansion of the marketplace and its important role in the development of American taste. Now, today, many of us would recognize the fact that we live in an entrepreneurial world where many of us have developed side hustles, like a podcast, in the hope of not just following our passion, but perhaps to bring in a little extra income to our families, or perhaps even with the hope that we can turn our passion into a full-time job. Now, I bring all of this up because in Republic of Taste, you note that there were like-minded entrepreneurs in the 19th century, men and women, although mostly men, who seized upon opportunities to create goods, services, and even experiences that would help early Americans prove and demonstrate their sense of taste and even their Republican virtue. Okay, so we have to take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor, and then I'd love for you to tell us more about these aesthetic entrepreneurs and how they were able to use the early American marketplace to develop side hustles based on early Republican tastes. Today's episode is made possible by the Omohundro Institute, proud publishers of award-winning books since 1943, and the professional home of today's guest, Kathy Kelly. Now, scholarly history books take a long time to develop. In fact, it often takes years to develop a history book because research takes such a long time. And although we often see just one name on the cover of a history book, history books are not solo efforts. Archivists, librarians, and curators provide historians with research help, and outside readers and editors often help authors shape their evidence and arguments into finished works. Now, in this regard, the Omohundro Institute is a really special place. The OI provides truly exceptional assistance to each author they publish, a process that has led to awards for well over half of its books. OI books win awards for many reasons. One reason is that editors and editorial apprentices vet each book. How do they do this? Well, each year the OI's manuscript editors train a class of graduate students as editorial apprentices. These apprentices then use their training to check every single footnote and reference in each author's manuscript to make sure that all citations are accurate and fully rendered. Now, another reason OI books win awards is that the OI's editors have an intense, hands-on approach to working with their authors. Do you remember Martin Bruckner, our guest historian from episode 177? Well, Martin is an OI author, and when the OI asked him to describe his experience, he said, quote, "Throughout the process, I felt the project was held to the highest standards of publishing, be it clarity of prose, validity of argument, or proof of evidence. I couldn't have asked for a better team to work with," end quote. So why am I sharing all of this information about the OI's publishing process with you? Well, because, like you, I love good historical research and writing, and I want you to know where some of the best sources for further reading are. I also wanted to take the opportunity to share more with you about why the Omohundro Institute is such a special place and why I love working there. Now, because the Omohundro Institute is such a special and awesome place, the OI negotiated with its publishing partner, the University of North Carolina Press, to get you an exclusive chance to save 50% on any Omohundro Institute book. Now, the catch is, this is a flash sale, so you need to visit benfranklinsworld.com/OI books and use promo code 01BFW before September 4th to take advantage of this discount. And yes, I put all the details of this flash sale in the show notes and in your Ben Franklin's World app. So Kathy, would you tell us more about the emergence of aesthetic entrepreneurs and how the early American marketplace allowed them to develop side hustles to profit from early Republican tastes?
I would love to tell you more about that. The aesthetic entrepreneurs are some of my favorite people in the book Republic of Taste. And they're my favorite people in part because they work so hard and they hustle so hard, to use your term. And the rewards could be significant, but they usually weren't. It's a horrible way to try and make a little extra income on the side, even when it pays off spectacularly, which it almost never does. These are people who are drawn to their particular side hustles, partly out of a sense of entrepreneurial ambition, but they also have a deep love of art. They really believe that the things that they're doing are making the Republic a better place, the paintings that they're creating, that the kind of tastes that they're help spreading throughout the nation are improving society. There's a sense of value there. And you see this everywhere. If you want to take itinerant portrait painters as an example, we could consider somebody like Chester Harding, who is a guy born into not much of middling anything in New England. And he's kicking around looking for some way to make a livelihood. He's trying to figure out some way to support his wife. He works as a chair maker. He enlists in the military. He's a sign painter, and he's living in the Midwest. An itinerant portrait painter comes through town. Harding has just enough money to get a portrait painted of his wife. He's captivated by what he later admits was a really terrible likeness. And he's captivated by the magic through which this portrait has been created, this likeness of this woman that he loves. And he decides almost immediately that he is going to teach himself to become an artist. And this means that he's an itinerant, right? He hits the road. He goes all over the United States, painting the portraits of anybody who will sit for him. Eventually, he raises enough capital that he can go train in London. He can get a formal studio training, get some academic training. And by the time that he ends his career, he's back in the United States. He's a high-style portrait painter. His clientele includes people like John Quincy Adams and John Marshall. He's truly made a successful career for himself. You could also consider on the other end of the spectrum, women. In particular, my favorite female entrepreneurs from the early Republic, two sisters, Mary Way and Eliza Way. They're born in New London, Connecticut, and they learn to paint, as far as anybody can tell, at one of these academies that teaches art along with reading and writing and arithmetic and history as a way to inculcate taste among the nation's young citizenry. Mary takes off to New York City early in the 1800s. She sets up a studio. She very quickly inserts herself into that city's artistic network, which includes people like Edward Malbone at that point in life. She starts off saying that she's going to paint anything. She'll paint large-size oil canvas portraits. She'll do full-length portraits. She'll do landscapes. She ends up having to support herself with miniature portraits. It's the cheapest kind of portrait on the market, but it was the kind of portrait that people thought that they would trust to a female painter. On the other, even lower on the sort of entrepreneurial hierarchy is her sister Eliza, who stays in New London, Connecticut. She marries a local guy, and she paints throughout her married life and well after her husband has died as a means of contributing to the family income. And in fact, at different points in her life, as far as I can tell, the money that she is making from painting is helping to keep the family afloat. It really is a significant contribution to helping this family stay together. She paints anything. She paints all of her neighbors. She paints people traveling through. For a while, she develops a side hustle painting corpses, painting pictures, again, ivory miniatures of dead babies. When all of those avenues of business bottom out, she teaches, and she hates teaching painting. She can't stand it, but she'll do it when she has to in order to keep her hand in as a woman making money as an artist, as an aesthetic entrepreneur in the early Republic. And so what's fascinating to me about that range, Chester Harding on the one hand, Mary Way and Eliza Way Champlain on the other, it's not just you've got diverse groups of people who are pursuing similar goals, but the ways in which that aesthetic marketplace is gendered. So Chester Harding, well before he goes to London, when he still is, by his own admission, a really rotten painter, and he's painting in the backwoods of Kentucky, he can pull $15 for a full-size painting, which he knocks off really quickly. He doesn't have a lot of skill. He's not wasting a lot of time making this painting work. Eliza, if she can get $6 for a miniature, she's doing really, really well. The ways in which these entrepreneurs are able to inhabit this marketplace has everything to do with gender as well as class.
Now, were there other types of entrepreneurs, both men and women, who were not painters? I mean, who was making a living by playing to the sense of early Republican taste?
Sure. An obvious route that would include both women and men is writing and writing for an audience and trying to sell literary productions. Beyond that, if you want to look for places that include women and men, you'd be looking at academies. Academies are one of the early places where women can find some kind of steady livelihood. And they can do so by teaching children, but they also teach what were called in the 18th century the ornamentals. They teach calligraphy. They might teach handwriting. They would teach ornamental embroidery. They might teach painting. And parents are paying extra for their children to learn these skills. It's often women who are teaching them, particularly in women's academies and in coeducational academies. When you start looking beyond that, though, the opportunities for women really dry up. For women to travel as itinerants, for example, in the way that William Dunlap, who is a phenomenal aesthetic entrepreneur, he is a writer, he's a playwright, he's a painter. He eventually becomes an art historian and writes the first history of art in North America from the colonial period through the early republic. He takes these massive canvases on tour and charges admission. That kind of opportunity is not available to women in the early republic for a variety of reasons. Women weren't seen as having the capacity or given the studio training to complete large-scale canvases. For a woman to get access to studio space, to build a canvas like that, much less to work on it and paint it, is highly unlikely, highly problematic. It was more difficult for women to travel alone than it was for men to travel. We definitely have itinerant women portrait painters in the early republic, but women traveling by themselves were suspect. Women business people traveling by themselves were suspect. And so in one of the autobiographies that we have left by one of these women, she goes out of her way to tell you again and again and again that her first order of business was ensuring that she appeared to be respectable, that she didn't want her potential clientele to think that she was loose or low class because she's a woman on the road. It's a lot harder for a woman to enter this marketplace because of the things it demands. Itineracy, the ability to move all over the United States quickly and by oneself, is the primary objective that prevents women from succeeding as entrepreneurs in the same way that men can succeed.
Okay, I have a question about motivations. So Chester Harding had a miniature painted of his wife and decides he wants to be a portrait painter. So he goes off to England, gets an education, and makes a career at it. Now, in terms of the women who became involved with painting or writing, or, in any of the other ways that you can make a living as an aesthetic entrepreneur, were women getting involved in these occupations to make a career for themselves? Or did they mostly get involved because they loved the work and wanted to bring a bit of extra money into their families?
I don't think that that's a question that reads back into the late 18th and the early 19th century very well. Women don't have careers as we would understand it. I mean, somebody like William Dunlap is expected to have a career. Dunlap is expected to learn to have a career and to build a path through the economy. Women were expected to help out and earn extra money when they needed to. The concept of a woman with a career doesn't read back or translate back into that period of time. And so even when you see women like Mary Way, who are supporting themselves, who never marry, who are professional painters, they don't have the same language to talk about a career motivation that their male counterparts would have. They have drive. They have a sense that they are gifted in some way. Mary Way absolutely is convinced that she's gifted, and her sense of confidence and the chutzpah that it takes to get this young woman to go to New York and to announce in the center of the United States' art world that she's an artist who can compete with and play on the same field as all of these other male artists. That takes a fair amount of self-confidence. But I'm not sure that women would have talked about having a career as such in that way, that life and language trajectory is not there for them.
We've been talking a lot about artwork. And if many of us want to go get a sense of early American tastes, all we need to do is visit an art museum. Now, one of my favorite art museums is the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, which has an entire wing dedicated to early American artists. So you can go visit this museum and see examples of silversmithing work, portrait and landscape paintings, cabinetry and furniture, different statues and statuettes, and, well, I think you get an idea of the variety here. But one item we won't see, at least I haven't seen it in this museum, is one that Kathy mentions in Republic of Taste, and that's the wax figure. Kathy, I wonder if you would tell us about early American interest in wax figures and why so many museums in the early Republic have them on display.
I'm glad that you asked. So wax figures are like so many other objects that are part of this Republic of Taste. They have a long Anglo history. The wax figures that Americans looked at in the late 18th century, the early 19th century, are the distant descendants of the wax figures that a lot of your listeners and you probably yourself have seen on display in Westminster Abbey in London, right? Have you been to see those?
Great question. I've been inside Westminster Abbey, but it was years ago and I don't remember the wax figures.
You need to go back and you need to look at the wax figures. They're in a particular wing and they're effigies of kings and queens and they're 18th century figures, 17th century figures, and they're really remarkable looking. So Anglo-Americans in the years following the Revolution are primed to look at wax figures. This is part of an English cultural tradition. Wax sculpture had toured the United States in the colonial period, starting, I think, in the 1730s, early 18th century. One of North America's first famous female artists is a woman named Patience Wright, who, with her sister, develops a business modeling wax busts and wax statues. Initially, they want to market these things as a substitute for portraits rather than local notables and elites sitting for an oil portrait. They thought that they could convince people to have wax statues made of themselves. But it turned out that wax was way too creepy looking. It kind of hovers between looking too lifelike and looking a lot like a dead person. Nobody wants it in their house, as it turns out. And so Patience and her sister build up a series of traveling shows, and they exhibit their wax up and down the coast of British North America. Patience's sister eventually opens a wax museum in Philadelphia that John Adams and George Washington frequent during the early days of the Continental Conventions. Patience goes to England and winds up opening a wax studio and wax salon there, where she actually creates wax figures for a paying audience. And you might ask, why would somebody pay to walk into a room and see a woman making a wax statue? She used to soften the wax by holding it between her legs underneath her skirt, and she would model it. The story goes blind. She can't see what she's doing. The massive wax, somebody's head, somebody's bust is between her legs, and then she pulls the bust out from between her legs, and it's a fully formed head. There's a great engraving of Patience Wright pulling Benjamin Franklin's head out from underneath her skirt that makes the rounds in the 18th century. So wax figures have this kind of history. They turn up with increasing frequency in the early Republic, partly because Americans want a pantheon. They want to be able to see the great leaders of the early Republic in as lifelike a form as possible. And so all kinds of museums commission wax portraits of George Washington's, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Ezra Stiles, lots of people who are deemed to be important to the early Republic. And in fact, if you're an artist, if you're a portrait painter, you can sometimes make more money modeling wax figures for these museums than you can actually in your mainline portrait business. Much more respectable to be a portrait painter than a wax modeler, but wax modeling is sometimes better money. And so you see people building a side hustle that way. And what's fascinating about these wax pantheons with all of the founding fathers, all of the luminaries would be life-size. They were advertised as being exactly as tall as George Washington, 6'2", dressed in duplicate sets of clothing, the exact same proportions, just like George Washington. And it's then believed that it's important to see reproductions of Washington or Franklin or Adams who are as lifelike as possible so that you can really fully take in and internalize the virtue that was encoded on those men's faces. But museum makers need to make a buck too. And so these statues of Washington and Jefferson and Adams are positioned alongside really sensationalistic images that are explicitly violent. The King of France being dragged off to the guillotine, Indians brandishing bloody scalps, murderers, people who've been wounded in battle, where the print advertisements that try and pull people into these exhibits talk about all of the bones and the arteries and the muscles that you can see where the musket ball pierced the general's thigh. All of that is there. And how viewers interpreted these exhibits where their lofty, respectable, elevating founders are positioned next to Indians and harlots and tavern wenches and midgets and giants and all of these sort of extreme physical types is sort of an open question.
Yeah, that seems really odd that you would have these figures that were meant to evoke taste and virtue right next to figures that we might consider, I don't know, perhaps garish, or at least next to figures that represented a poor sense of taste.
And yet, that's what you got. And when museum proprietors and the men who mount these traveling shows and drag this stuff from place to place, when they do so, when they advertise what they're doing, everything is sort of thrown in all hugger-mugger. They insist, when talking out of one side of their mouths, that you really need to come to my exhibit and you really need to pay to see Washington and Jefferson and Adams and all of the founders. But you're also going to see this garish, to use your word, sensationalistic, shocking, a lot of, from what I can tell, a lot of the ladies who are figured in these exhibits as belles, lovely ladies, the belles of New Haven, the belles of any particular town. As far as I can tell, it's the 18th century equivalent of cheesecake. The women are fashionably dressed. The dresses are cut really low. There's a lot of cleavage. I mean, these are ladies who are wax ladies who are putting their bodies on display. And it's all just sort of thrown in there. Sentiment and patriotism, high-minded political idealism with the worst kind of fear-mongering around ethnic and racial lines, servile slaves, dangerous Indians. It's all in there together. And that's what sells.
Could it be that these sensational figures were not just there to sell tickets, but perhaps also to make taste more attractive to people who had a lesser sense of taste? I mean, could it be that they were there perhaps to make taste more attractive to people from more humble origins? And I ask because, as we've been talking, it really seems to me that taste is a fairly elite concept. I mean, we've talked about museums and music and art and literature, and all of these are aesthetics that we would associate with people who are at least from the middle class. People who have some amount of leisure time and money to enjoy these things. These aren't things that we would associate with the poor.
Well, it's definitely not associated with the working poor, and it certainly isn't associated with the desperately poor or the enslaved or the indentured. But the entry point into this world of taste, especially as we move into the 19th century, is lower than you might think. Tasteful goods. I mean, who can afford an oil copy of Gilbert Stuart's Washington portrait? And that's the unfinished portrait of Washington that's currently at Massachusetts Historical Society. That is reproduced over and over and over again, right? I mean, this is the Washington that we know. Who can afford that? Yeah, not many people. Who can afford a pretty decent sized engraving that's a copy of that? More people. Who can afford a cheap engraving? Even more people. By the time that you get to the early 19th century, you have a society and an art culture that is marked by copies of copies of copies of copies. And as those particular images are copied down the food chain, the price point is lower than one might think. One of the ways that you can track this is looking at what women do in this sort of market for taste or this art market. One of the kinds of things that women wind up painting for almost no money at all, but it's something, are watch papers, little teeny paper circles with a watercolor, usually watercolor design or very small picture. And you would open up a pocket watch, and on one side of that pocket watch, you'd have the watch. And the other side, you'd have the inside of the lid to the case. And you put that watch paper inside there so that when you open up your pocket watch, you have a tasteful piece of art. Watch papers are really cheap, and it's a way that you can get into that market and show your taste. You're right that taste is always an elite construct, or it's always exclusionary, but you don't want to assume that the point of entry begins with the middle class. When Chester Harding has that itinerant paint his wife, he's not anybody's idea of a solid and successful member of the bourgeoisie. The entry point is lower, a lot lower than one might imagine. And one can also enter this world of taste by becoming an aesthetic entrepreneur. Eliza Way Champlain and Mary Way are desperately poor through most of their lives. Mary Way can't make her rent in New York City. Eliza Way Champlain can't make her rent after her husband dies over and over again in New London, Connecticut. They're worried about how they're going to eat. They're worried about how they're going to fuel their homes. And art for them is a way to mitigate the straitened circumstances that they find themselves in addition to being a passion, a calling, something that they deeply love.
So taste was something that clearly impacted early Americans' lives. Are there any linkages between early Americans' concern for taste and our own concern for taste now in the 21st century?
I wish I could say that it had, because at least in the early Republic, ideas about taste were yoked to a sense of morality and civic virtue and a deep sense of self-cultivation and self-examination. And I don't see that in contemporary American discussions of taste. Now taste really is, you prefer a house that's Victorian and I want to live in mid-century modern. Taste has lost almost all of its political register. So thinking back to last Christmas when Melania Trump decorated her own Christmas White House and lots of people jumped on her less than completely traditional style and they jumped on her taste. There was no deeper meaning to that discussion except that some people don't like Melania Trump and some people don't like Donald Trump, and they thought that the White House looked different than it should. It didn't register as saying anything particularly important about Melania Trump, about Donald Trump, that people weren't already saying in more profound and more incisive ways elsewhere.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, how would the development of the Republic of Taste have been different if there had been no United States? So if the 13 colonies of British North America had not declared and secured their independence from Great Britain, would early Americans have been so concerned with ideas about taste?
Absolutely. They would have been concerned about ideas about taste because their peers across the Atlantic were. Taste would have continued to signify, it just wouldn't have signified with the kind of Republican meaning, with that sort of investment of an explicitly Republican political significance that taste had in the 18th and the early 19th century. Taste was always, in the early Republic, one part gentility and one part sort of Republican political culture. Take away the revolution, you just have a preoccupation with taste that's 100% gentility.
Now, we know you're really busy working as the editor of books for the Omohundro Institute's book series, but are you also working on any historical research?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Liz. I'm slowly, given my new position as the editor of books at the Omohundro Institute, I'm slowly making progress on a new book called Making Peace, Loyalists in the Early U.S. Republic. And it's a book about loyalists who stay in the early Republic. We know a lot about the ones who leave, who expatriate in the wake of the revolution or during the revolution, but we don't know a whole lot about the ones who stay put. And it's a project that interests me a lot, especially in our own politically contentious moment where neighbors, I'm thinking about my own life, where my own neighbors have very, very different political sensibilities, very, very different political views than I do. And I want to know how neighbors and family members, in some cases, and community members learn to make peace with one another after the really vituperative, violent conflict of the revolution. And the question that I'm trying to answer is, what did people have to forget? And what do people have to remember on a daily basis for loyalists to be able to reintegrate themselves into the early Republic, to create a shared U.S. culture?
And on a slightly different note, since we have you, we know that the Omohundro Institute has been the proud publisher of award-winning books since 1943. And I wonder if the OI has any new books coming out that we should be aware of. So, Kathy, does the OI have any forthcoming or new books that you think we might really enjoy?
Liz, there are two books that I want to call your attention to, and they're really different. I think they say something about the range of things that we're publishing. One is a book that's forthcoming by Drew Newman, and it's a book about colonists who were taken captive by Native Americans in the early Republic, and it's about how reading and writing practices do and don't look different as a consequence of captivity. The title for that book is still in play, but it's going to be out this fall. And the author's name is Drew Newman, Newman. The other book that I want to alert your readers to is going to be out next spring, and it's From a Very Different Corner of Vast Early America. That is a collection of essays that's designed to commemorate 1619 in Virginia. Many of your listeners will know that 1619 is an important year in Virginia's history. It's the year in which the House of Burgesses begins to meet. We have legislative government. It's regular, first time. But it's also the year that the first African Americans arrive as slaves in the colony of Virginia. And so 1619 is a year that resonates with both political importance, but also with importance for the history of slavery, the history of race relations, not only in the history of Virginia, but in the history of the American colonies. That book will be out in spring of 19. And I think both of those books are titles that your readers will enjoy, books that will help give them a sense of the vastness of what we here at the Institute call vast early America.
Thanks for those titles, Kathy. Now, if we have any questions about taste in the early republic or about the Omohundro Institute's forthcoming titles, how can we get in contact with you?
Anybody who listens to your podcast can reach out to me via email at cekelly01@wm.edu. You can also find me on the Omohundro Institute's website, and that should give people plenty of access to me.
Catherine Kelly, thank you so much for joining us and for helping us better understand taste and its role and importance in the early American Republic.
Liz, thanks so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
The Republic of Taste was both a place and an abstract notion that a shared sense of taste could bring Americans together as one people. Of course, as Kathy revealed, when we look at the Republic of Taste in the early Republic's documentary and material record, we won't find just one idea of what constituted good taste. Because there wasn't just one person or one group who defined good taste for all early Americans. Instead, what we'll find are objects, artwork, and printed material that reveal a wide range of ideas about taste and how Americans might use it to cultivate a sense of shared national identity. And this is where we can see the Republic of Taste at work on the ground in early America. The early Republic's printed and material historical record allows us to see the advice that newspaper printers, book authors, and magazine writers offered to Americans who wanted to cultivate a good sense of taste. Through the period's books and plays, we can get a sense of the ideas that early Americans thought contributed to a good sense of civic and moral character. Plus, when we look at all the wax figures, portraits, and other pieces of artwork from the early Republic, we can see just how early Americans conceived of good virtue and character. We can see this right in the faces of George Washington and the other founding fathers. Now, we can also use the documentary and material record about taste to explore the gendered nature of early Republican society. As Kathy noted, men could make a career out of being an aesthetic entrepreneur. Women could not. Men could take advantage of taste and use it as a way to both spread virtue and ideas about American identity and to profit from it, while women were more limited in the ways that they could use and profit from taste. Like men, taste offered women some opportunity to shape and promote their ideas about what constituted good American character, but they were never going to see as much profit from it. Today, taste is different. As Kathy pointed out, we still have taste in the United States, but it's no longer imbued with the same civic and moral meaning that early Americans once believed that it had. For us, taste is more about a matter of personal preference. Look for more information about Kathy, her book, Republic of Taste, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/201. If you'd like to learn a new language or refresh a language you've already learned, you should try Babbel. They're offering you 50% off your first 3 months when you visit babbel.com and use promo code BFWorld. That's Babbel, BABBEL.com, and use promo code BFWorld. And if you'd like to save money on some really great books about early American history, make sure you take advantage of the Omohundro Institute's flash sale. To save 50% on any OI book, visit benfranklinsworld.com/OI books and use promo code 01BFW. Remember, the sale is only good through September 3rd, 2018. So make sure you visit benfranklinsworld.com/OI books and use promo code 01BFW. Finally, taste may not hold political and civic meaning for us anymore, but do you think we could still use taste as an identifier of group belonging? I mean, do you still think taste plays or could play a social function for us? This is what I'm going to think about this week, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please share them with me. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.